America, as you have no doubt heard many times on mainstream television, is the most powerful nation on the planet, in the history of the planet, by the way. There's literally nothing we can't do because, well, we're America. And so if we choose to do something, we can. If we don't like reality, we'll just change it to be something that we like. Well, that's what we say. The actual reality is, well, shall we just kindly say, somewhat different. But we're going to look today at some of these realities and some of the things that we say, which can charitably be called fiction, maybe less likely say just misguided. But in any case, we want to show you what is really going on here. And then we're going to talk to somebody who's, in my view, the most amazing diplomat mind and foreign policy mind in America today. Ambassador Chas Freeman is with us back today. I'm very grateful to have you back on. Man, we would be in a lot better place if you were actually in the White House and would be empowered to do the right things, which is a necessary component of that. But anyway, but we're glad to have you and your wisdom with us today, Ambassador.
Thank you, Danny.
So here's what we're going to do today, folks. We're going to take a look at some of the things in a couple of different theaters of operation, both in the Israeli-Hamas situation, in the Ukrainian-Russia war, and then even some domestic U.S. policies. And we're going to you'll be able to see without too much explanation that we're making some really crazy decisions in some things. But we're going to talk about, all right, what could we have done? And maybe even in some of these cases, a lot of people are not even aware of just how much trouble and how many problems these things cause us. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so eager to have Ambassador Freeman to look at it today, to be able to explain, here's what you may not realize is actually going on behind the scenes, and here's what should go on behind the scenes. So let's jump right into it. First of all, we have Biden. Let me set the stage for you here. This is going to be April 10th. It's going to be 3 days before Iran launches its attack against Israel, this 350 drone attack. Now, many people at the time, when that happens on the 13th, they're going to be calling this an unprovoked, unimaginable attack, that we have to defend, etc. Biden here, 3 days before that happened, is going to be talking about how he has the backs of Israel. The context is important here because this is coming after Israel has just violated one of the most foundational principles of international relations, and they destroyed a building of the diplomatic compound of Iran in Damascus, which is a violation of the rules-based international order we claim to cherish, that we want to hold other people accountable for. But in light of that, and in light of the fact that there has been lots of disputes between the United States and Israel up to this point about taking care of the Palestinian people, about killing too many of them, about planning an operation in Rafah that could kill tens of thousands more potentially, lots of conflict going on. But in the light of this looming attack, here's what President Biden says.
We also want to address the Iranian threat. They're threatening to launch a significant attack on Israel. As I told Prime Minister Netanyahu, our commitment to Israel's security against these threats from Iran and its proxies is ironclad. Let me say it again, ironclad. We're going to do all we can to protect Israel's security.
So, Mr. Ambassador, if the primary purpose of American foreign policy is the protection of the U.S. national security, the protection of our way of life, and improving our situation around the globe, how does this line up with given all the context that happened prior to that? What signal did that send to Netanyahu in Israel?
Basically, that our president is a would-be member of the Israeli war cabinet. He might as well be in terms of the interests he's espousing. This is not about American interests. It's about Israeli interests. It was handing the traditional blank check to Israel. Israel has known that it can do whatever it wants with impunity. And if it suffers consequences, the United States will make it whole. And that has been the case for decades. It's not original to President Biden. And we can see the results. Israel has been encouraged to become an international pariah, conducting genocide in Gaza, assisting in the savaging of the Palestinian population in the occupied West Bank, engaged in expanding settlements and expanding its borders at will in defiance of international law, UN Security Council resolutions, international opinion, and the United States.
All right.
Every time we give advice to the current Israeli government, they do the opposite. And they do that in the full confidence that, as our president said, whatever they do, we'll just go on helping them the way we have.
You know, the clip I just showed was pretty strong endorsement of what you just said. But you said this has been going on for decades. It's not new, but it does feel to me like it is worse now than I've ever seen it. And this clip, next clip by John Kirby after the attack by Iran and after Israel's response, really to me shows a new depth. What do you think? Check this out.
Prime Minister certainly came away from that conversation knowing how serious Joe Biden is in terms of protecting Israel and Israel's security. And our commitment to them, as he said, is ironclad. We proved that to a fare thee well on Saturday night. And the president made clear to Prime Minister Netanyahu that going forward, we will continue to prove that when it comes to defending Israel. We're going to keep making the diplomatic efforts we need to do to try to prevent a wider war in the region. And the president pre-positioned additional military resources in the region in the last 10 days just to make sure that we could meet our commitments.
I mean, what you just said just screamed out at that it's like we're the national security apparatus of the state of Israel. Like that we have to prove to Netanyahu that we actually will defend them. I don't get that at all. That was crazy.
Well, we did prove that without us, Israel is indefensible because the Iranians, notwithstanding the very heavy involvement of the United States, Britain, and France in shooting down missiles aimed at Israel, managed to hit the targets they wanted to hit. And they demonstrated they could penetrate Israeli defenses even if we were there. So I think the most notable part of Admiral Kirby's statement is while he refers to diplomacy, he describes no diplomacy. There is none. There was an empty call to Netanyahu, which he ignored, saying that, well, we'll be with you if you suffer any consequences for the outrageous act that you just conducted against the embassy in Damascus. That is not diplomacy. What he referred to were military actions. So I don't see anything in this administration's actions really anywhere to suggest that they understand what diplomacy is or how to conduct it. What they know how to do is bomb people and send weapons into proxy wars to enable foreigners to kill each other.
So if you had been the Secretary of State on the 1st of April, and this embassy compound was hit, and you knew that a response was coming from Iran, knew for sure, what would you have said privately to the president to recommend that they say to Israel? And then what would you have said publicly? Because it seems like we wouldn't say, hey, y'all did something stupid, you're on your own, because that would have other problems too. So what would you say privately, or what would you say publicly?
Well, I think you need to realize that the Iranians said, apparently, to us and others, that if the Security Council acted to condemn Israel for its actions, they would not conduct a retaliatory attack.
Oh, wow, I didn't hear that.
And we just brushed that aside. We vetoed the effort to condemn Israel for this attack, along with the French and British. That is the end of any credibility at all for us internationally in enforcing international law. Because, as you said, the sanctity of embassies, of ambassadors, is a foundational principle of international law. It's enshrined in treaties and conventions. It has always been respected until recently. The Israeli action then inspired Ecuador to violate the immunity of the Mexican embassy in Quito. So what we're seeing is an Israeli-sponsored, US-enabled breakdown in international law. What would I have done? I would have not vetoed the condemnation. I would have at least have abstained. I would hope that we would join in it, because we've just set a precedent that's going to come home to roost. Second, I would have so that would be the public action. Privately, I would say to Netanyahu, look, we're coming to the end of our road here with you. If you keep violating international law and doing things intended to embroil us in your quarrels with others like Iran, there will come a day when we do not have your back. So we're warning you, pull up before the precipice.
Yeah, that's the man, and that makes so much sense, because that actually reestablishes our leadership both internationally and within our bilateral relationship with Israel, because they would see that there actually is a line beyond which they can't go further as long as we acted on that. That would have brought the nation, I think, back into some degree of sanity. Unfortunately, because that didn't happen, and actually because it hadn't happened before that either, what we're going to have is a perpetuation of what you're about to see. So President Biden has been on the record really since October 7th and all the way going forward that it's still America's policy for a two-state solution, at least publicly. He said it again in the State of the Union address, and officials have said it several times. And in response to these very strong words from the United States senior officials, here's how Benjamin Netanyahu characterizes those requests.
They support the action that we're taking to destroy the remaining terrorist battalions of Hamas. They say that once we destroy the Hamas, the last thing we should do is put in Gaza, in charge of Gaza, the Palestinian Authority that educates its children towards terrorism and pays for terrorism. And they also support my position that says that we should resoundingly reject the attempt to ram down our throats a Palestinian state, because the majority of Israelis understand that if we don't do this, what we'll have is a repetition of the October 7th massacre, which is bad for Israel, bad for the Palestinians, bad for the future of peace in the Middle East.
Ram down our throats. I wonder who he meant by that.
Well, it's very hard to see who he meant by that, because there's no ram in Washington these days. But I think, here we have to parse the prime minister's words. He made an egregious statement in English, clearly directed at us and at the American Jewish communities that still support Israel, which are less and less. And if you go through that statement and put it together with what you just showed, what you see is an absolute refusal to acknowledge reality, that Israel's actions have any consequences for it, either reputational or otherwise. Certainly, they're having tremendous reputational consequences. They haven't had any practical consequences because of the Biden administration's wholehearted support of and enablement of Israeli actions. The notion that there can never be a Palestinian state ties in with the often voiced Israeli demand that, quote, that people recognize Israel's right to exist, by which they mean no one else has a right to exist between the river and the sea, the Jordan and the Mediterranean. And he's just saying, we are going to conduct an occupation until we successfully exterminate or remove the Palestinians from the territories that we control. That's his program. And I don't think there are very many Americans of whatever faith who support that. And I see this we see this now with the protests by our youth on university campuses. Very bravely, I'm old enough to remember protests against the Vietnam War. They were largely motivated by people trying to avoid being drafted and sent into a horrible conflict in which many Americans died. These kids are not motivated by any desire to avoid anything. Their moral indignation is pure and uncompromising. And they're taking huge risks. And, I think we have, of course, the usual situation, which I think we're seeing on the screen now, of people taking advantage of protests to do things that the protesters themselves would not approve of. So I think my hat's off to those students. My hat is off to those students. They are defending freedom of speech, academic freedom, in a context in which the Israel lobby has effectively under the direction of Mr. Netanyahu, which you can see in his statements, tried to smear them with the charge of anti-Semitism. There was even an incident in Boston, which is on video, of a protest demonstration, infiltrated by two people carrying Israeli flags who yelled, "Kill the Jews," hoping to demonstrate that the protest was anti-Semitic. They were rounded up by the protesters and shooed off the campus. I think this is really a test for our country.
Yeah.
It domestically as well as internationally. Either we believe in the First Amendment or we don't. Either we believe in academic freedom and that universities are a place for discussion of controversial issues, or we don't.
Yeah, and this is a lot of this problem is coming from the Congress itself. I've seen some bills being brought up, or I don't remember if it was passed or not. That these people should be deported if they say these pro Hamas, which is the way it's being characterized. They say
Congress has just legislated, just passed legislation which equates anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, and makes it a legal offense to voice criticism of Israel. So much for the First Amendment.
Yeah,
this is really shameful.
It is very
really shameful.
Yeah, and it is a big problem, and it's continuing on. So this is from earlier today. I'm going to show you here in just a second from the Secretary of State, the position I wish you had held. But and here's why.
Don't wish that on me.
I know that you're saying, why would I be so cruel to thrust you into that position and that pain? And I get that. But as a selfish American, I would like to see your leadership up there. But here's the actual Secretary of State. And in the context, again, here is this issue with Rafah. We seem to be saying that we're drawing a red line, that you can't go into Rafah or there's going to be some consequences. But first of all, actually, before I get to that one, let me show you what Netanyahu has said about the Rafah operation.
When people tell us don't go into Rafah, that's like telling the Allies, listen, don't go into Berlin, leave a quarter of the Nazi army intact. That's ridiculous. If we leave a quarter of the Hamas fighting terrorist battalions in place, they'll regroup, reconquer Gaza, and in fact, perpetrate once again what they vowed to do, which is to repeat the October 7th massacre over and over and over again.
So even before I show you what Blinken said today about that, I wonder if you can comment again and parse some of the words here, because this is pretty egregious misinformation in my view.
Well, first of all, the assumption of the statement, or the presupposition that Israel has somehow decimated Hamas is totally false. There are still attacks on Israeli troops in the northern area of Gaza, which they claimed 5 months ago to have purged of any Hamas presence. Second, Hamas, in his speech, is a synonym for Palestinian nationalism. And indeed, Hamas does represent Palestinian nationalism. It is a political movement which has grown a military arm in response to Israeli mistreatment of the largest concentration camp in the world, which is Gaza. To compare a jailbreak from that camp to the Allies marching on Berlin is absurd, absolutely absurd. In fact, it is deeply offensive.
Yeah, and I think that point you made there is so vital to really zero in on, is that it's Palestinian nationalism, and that's one of the reasons why I've been saying from a military perspective, from the very beginning, that since Israel entered into Gaza with this operation, is that Netanyahu has put his country on a path that cannot succeed. His military force that he's going in to achieve peace for Israel, which is his stated objective, cannot be accomplished, because now then the Palestinian nationalism is just on fire, and the anger and hatred towards Israel is, in my view, dwarfs anything that existed prior to the 7th of October.
I think Mr. Netanyahu will go down in history as the man whose ego and career ambitions sacrificed Israel. I think he is causing circumstances to arise in which Israel cannot hope to, with any assurance, to survive. And why do I say that? Because the best people in Israel have left already. What we see now is a split between European Jews who were the inspiration and founders of Israel, and the Mizrahim, the Oriental Jews, Arab Jews, who were forced out of their rather comfortable situations in Arab countries because of Israeli atrocities during the War of Independence and the Nakba, and they are now in charge. I think one of the great mistakes that people make is assuming, however, that this is all about Mr. Netanyahu. It isn't. If Mr. Netanyahu left this cabinet, even worse elements would be unchecked in ruling it. I don't think very many people in Israel feel secure anymore. I think many of them feel that their government is not interested in their well-being or the release of the hostages, but is playing games with them. I think many of them fear the establishment of a sort of Israeli version of the Islamic State, which carries out atrocities against non-believers and which makes the life of believers impossible. And I don't think Israel can go on like this. So I think Mr. Netanyahu is rightly condemned for putting his own interests ahead of the people of Israel, and certainly ahead of world Jewry. Because what he is doing, to the extent it evokes automatic support from Jewish communities around the world, puts them in jeopardy. If you behave in an utterly despicable fashion, you invite denunciation. You want to call that anti-Semitism? It isn't. It is a response to your own bad behavior.
Right. And I remember I want to say it was the very first week of the war. I can't remember if it was an email you and I shared or if it was on one of our shows, but you called it right at the beginning that these events are almost certainly going to increase actual, whether it's terrorist attacks or whatever, or certainly a lot of vilification of Jews around the world. And it's definitely playing out that way.
I think it's terrible. I have Jewish grandchildren. I don't want to see them suffer the consequences of these grievous errors by the state of Israel.
Right. Yeah. And unfortunately, I think that we're close to potentially having that same or having the situation worsened. It really a lot depends on what happens in the coming operation to go into Rafah. So here is now Secretary Blinken earlier today making a plea for Israel to not do that. Let's see what he says.
Look, our position is clear. It hasn't changed. It won't change. We will not support a major military operation in Rafah absent an effective plan to make sure that civilians are not harmed. And no, we've not seen such a plan.
So, yeah, we haven't seen such a plan and we will not support it. But given everything that happened before, and especially Biden and Kirby's support for Israel, no matter what they had done prior to the Iranian issue, it's hard for me to see any scenario whereby Netanyahu, he's so emphatically put it, is going to go into Rafah and they must, et cetera, that he would say, oh, well, if America doesn't want to, I guess we won't. Seems to me that at some point he probably is going to do this with or without our blessing.
He's going to do it because if he doesn't do it, his cabinet will repudiate him and he will lose office and he'll end up in jail for corruption, which goes to the point I was saying. This is a man with a great deal of vanity and self-esteem who's willing to sacrifice his own country for his own benefit. I think Secretary Blinken is absolutely correct. Our position hasn't changed. We have consistently enabled Israeli massacres, atrocities, and we continue to do so. And
I don't think that's the position he meant that hadn't changed, but in reality, that is right.
It's not, his statement is not consistent with $26 billion of additional aid to Israel to enable genocide. So it is not consistent with tolerating settler attacks on food convoys, which just happened. And it is not consistent with serious opposition to what the Israelis are doing. So I think he's full of it. And I believe everyone in the world now looks at him with pity because of his incredible hypocrisy. I note that he has also said of the latest effort to release the hostages, produce a ceasefire, that Hamas has to accept this because Israel's made a generous offer. Well, what is that offer? It's a few weeks of respite for the people in Gaza, and it is not believable because of what Mr. Netanyahu consistently says. He's going to do it. And the only question at this point is the United States going to continue to enable him to carry out genocide or not? And that is what the kids in the universities are protesting. They're not anti-Semitic. They are not even pro-Palestinian, in my view. They are against American complicity in a heinous crime.
Yeah, and it's still hard for me to understand how we continue to do that. But one of the other related issues down here is the peer issue, which the President Biden again announced on at the State of the Union that we were going to do. And now then, according to Politico this morning, those operations could actually begin as soon as this weekend. Now, there was a now quickly famous exchange between Representative Gates and Secretary of Defense Austin in Congress a couple of days ago on this very issue. And I want your view on this on the backside of this. Check this out.
This is a very telling moment, Mr. Secretary, because you've said something that's quite possible that could happen, right? Shots from Gaza on our service members, and then the response, our armed service members shooting live fire into Gaza. That is a possible outcome here so that we can become the Port Authority and run this pier. Right?
That's correct. You know, I expect that we will always have the ability to protect ourselves.
Don't you think that counts as boots on the ground? President Biden told the country that we weren't going to have boots on the ground in Gaza.
And we won't.
Okay, but you guys parse the distinction between, like, when Americans think boots on the ground, they think Americans in harm's way or engaged actively in a conflict. You guys seem to be sort of saying that boots on a pier connected to the ground, connected to service members shooting into Gaza, doesn't count as boots on the ground?
It does not.
What do you say to that at the end? I'm still shocked.
Well, this actually is a serious issue, as has been illustrated by the fact that we've already been shot at. Not clear by whom, whether it was Israeli settlers or it was people from Hamas or Islamic Jihad or some other group operating in Gaza. But I think it's fair to say that this is a $320 million boondoggle. It's not going to feed people in Gaza adequately as it goes into operation. The land routes, which are the most efficient way of moving food in. And in the past, even when Israel, for the last 17 years, had Gaza on what they called humanitarian rations, meaning minimal food, just enough to keep people alive, that required 150 trucks a day. Israel now inspects every truck that goes in, every item on it. If there are zippers in sleeping bags, if there are toenail clippers in a vanity kit, they reject the entire shipment. Food is not getting in, even before the settlers interrupted the first convoy through Erez, the Erez opening, which has come back to life. So this is a boondoggle. This is a political gesture to appear to be doing something when you're not. And it isn't going to be enough to stop starvation. And it is very risky for all of the reasons that Congressman Gaetz mentioned.
Now, let me ask you this question, though, because on the issue of, it's enough to keep them from starving, there was a report that came out that apparently was given to Secretary Blinken last week, I think it was, from the USAID and I think the WFP, where Mr. Siri came out and said, look, we calculate that the conditions right now are such that all three thresholds for actual famine are about to occur. And within 6 weeks, we could start to see large scale deaths from starvation, aside from the military situation. And some have suggested that it's already past the point. And so even if you increase the amount of food going in now, it may be too late for thousands of people already. What's going to happen if this food aid doesn't get in enough and doesn't stop that? And all of a sudden, now then we have like hundreds of people a day potentially dying of starvation.
Well, the Israelis seem determined to prevent adequate food getting in, precisely because their objective is to depopulate Gaza. I think people have to realize Blinken sees genocide in Xinjiang, where the Uyghurs are subject to forced assimilation. Nobody gets killed. They go into re-education camps. They learn how to speak Chinese so they can cope in the larger Chinese society. That's genocide, really? And what we're seeing in Gaza isn't. So I think we've established such an ludicrous position internationally that nobody gives us any belief at all anymore. And our spokespeople, I pity Admiral Kirby. He's turning into a pretzel with the contortions that he makes in order to, deny reality. The whole world can see what the reality is. Our kids see what the reality is.
Yeah.
That is why the Congress has gone after TikTok, because that's the principal mechanism for the kids getting the news that they get. If you can cut that off, then they'll be subject to the same censorship that all the corporate media impose on other channels. This is really, it's very hard to separate the domestic consequences in terms of loss of freedom of speech, loss of freedom to assemble and petition the government, loss of discipline in the police forces, all these things from the foreign consequences. We don't represent the hope of the world that we began our country with, in which for centuries people looked to us as a country that always aspired to become better, more moral. Now we look like cynical sinners
who are leading the charge in some directions. But okay, so that's the condition you just described very eloquently that exists today. But it appears to me that there could be a change, maybe a tipping point where things could start to change rapidly if the food doesn't get in enough and actually Palestinians do start dying in large numbers, especially if you see these emaciated bodies like something from the Holocaust or so, which apparently is a very real possibility. Could that actually prompt a turning point, not just that people view us with contempt, but it turns into something else? What do you think is possible?
Well, I think our international clout, our influence has been disastrously weakened by the hypocrisy and double standards we have in place. There's an atrocity in Bucha, in Ukraine, and we go berserk. We're seeing daily atrocities, and we do nothing except feed the people who are committing the atrocities, not the victims. So the international consequences of this are very grave. All of our prattle about the rules-bound order is out the window. Nobody believes in that. But I think the domestic consequences are also going to be very great. I go back to the Vietnam protests at the time. Many people condemned the protesters as stooges of Ho Chi Minh and Hanoi. In the long run, however, those same students that were vilified in the name of supporting government action proved to be right about Vietnam and what it represented. And their view is now the majority view. I think we are going to see a change in this country. It may take some time, but I think this protest movement has the possibility of turning into a broad anti-war movement and fundamentally changing American politics and foreign policy. And I say that as someone who confronts an election in November between two tired old white men, both of whom seem to be warmongers. So I think this is not acceptable to the younger generation. I count myself not as part of that generation, but I empathize with them. I think they are brave. I admire them. It
ironically may be our real hope of achieving some differences. I want to shift in the remaining time we have right now to the other side of the world, where we have another list of some of these problems, some of which you're going to see how it's impacting. You're talking about our view internationally. I'm going to show you in a minute what one of our adversaries thinks and how that's actually a problem too, about how we're viewed when it comes to what could come next. But first of all, let's look with, let's see, I guess it was 2 or 3 days ago, President Zelensky in Ukraine went on to his camera and told the world that he deserves 10 years worth of support from the United States.
Our teams, Ukraine and the United States, are currently working on a bilateral security agreement, and we are already working on a specific text. We are discussing the specific foundations of our security and cooperation. We are also working on fixing specific levels of support for this year and for the next 10 years, including armed support, financial, political, and joint arms production. The agreement should be truly exemplary and reflect the strength of American leadership.
So to me, it sounds like he is kind of baiting us by saying, oh, yeah, you guys are this global leader. Well, how about forking over some cash here? And this 61 billion wasn't enough. I want 10 years worth, or you're not really the leader that you say you are. And so far, it seems like we're ready to bend over to that, too.
Well, I think Ukraine is entitled to security, and I would have no objection to the United States buttressing Ukraine's security, but in the context of peace with Russia. Not in the context that Mr. Zelensky seems to posit, which is perpetual confrontation between Ukraine and the broader European community and Russia. Europe cannot be at peace. Ukraine cannot enjoy security without an agreed relationship with Russia. And that's a fact. And I think those people who follow Mr. Zelensky by arguing for a sort of Korean solution, as though that were a solution, a DMZ somewhere in Ukraine, where heavily armed forces confront each other and occasionally kill each other. I think that is madness. It is not necessary. But, Ukraine, a security guarantee for Ukraine might well be part of a peace agreement with Russia. That's a different matter. That is not what he's asking for. And I think his statement will remind everybody that Ukraine is not only the poorest state in Europe, the poorest country, but it's also, by a wide measure, the most corrupt. And asking the American people to keep forking over cash to feed Ukrainian corruption and buy villas all over the place and put money in Swiss and Cypriot banks is just not reasonable. Yes, help Ukraine make peace. Buttress the peace, make Ukraine feel secure, but don't do that.
And of course, there's so many on the West are only too happy, and I'm talking the elite, are only too happy to go down that path because they want perpetual conflict with Russia, and they're so happy to let Ukrainians die in the process of that. And I know because Stoltenberg himself cited that same 10-year period that he wants to continue to provide that. And he keeps giving this fiction that there will be in NATO. Secretary Blinken says that they're going to be in NATO. If you were given all that mess and given Zelensky's comments here that he made publicly, what would you say, again, behind the scenes to Ukraine and also to our government? What should we do?
The first thing is Ukraine must repeal the decree that prohibits a negotiated settlement. Zelensky is, people talk as though we should try to get the Russians to the negotiating table. They're ready to come anytime. They've made that clear from the very beginning. The only parties that have refused negotiation are us and the government in Kyiv, which actually has a law on the books prohibiting negotiation with Russia. That's got to go. Ukraine, in its own interest, has to be able to make a peace that can secure it. And we have a role in that. And that role properly is not obstructing negotiations. So I would say the first thing is clear the air so that people can begin to talk about how Ukrainians, Russians, Europeans and Russians, and Americans and Russians can live without the danger of nuclear or other war.
Well, that would certainly be a welcome change, which I would certainly like to see. Now, it's keeping with the theme of the Russia-Ukraine war, I'm going to play a clip here by Vladimir Putin a week or so ago. And in it, he's talking to a friendly audience there, and he's talking about an exchange he had with Jacques Chirac a number of years ago about the United States. And there's a couple things in here that I think you can read into what he's saying. Number one is just how he views the United States. And then another is how others, apparently some of our friends, view the United States. And I want you to talk on the backside of this about what the implications are for our credibility and ability to actually shape events in ways that are beneficial to our country and the world. Check this out.
Сейчас тоже Ширака нет, Жака Ширака. Он был крупным таким политическим деятелем. Я как-то его спросил, почему американское руководство так себя ведет? Ну, так агрессивно и так недальновидно действует в некоторых случаях. Он мне по-русски ответил, потому что некультурные.
So people say that because Putin's this evil guy and bent on evil and he's all evil and he has no good in him, that we should dismiss him and even, repudiate him, etc. But if you're going to have relations around the world, it's got to be an adult foreign policy where even if somebody's your outright enemy, which he's technically not right now, you still have to talk to him, right?
Especially when you have a conflict, you need to talk. I note in two notable examples of intelligent diplomatic engagement during conflict are the fact that the Chinese, during the 1962 Sino-Indian border war, kept their embassy open and alive in New Delhi. They did not withdraw their diplomats. They did the same thing in Hanoi during the 1979 Sino-Vietnamese war. We should learn from them. The time when you need to talk to the enemy most is when you're shooting at each other. Of course, you should be talking to them to make sure that doesn't happen, which we don't. But I think it's amazing. We have now no diplomatic dialogue at all with Russia. We have no diplomatic dialogue at all with Iran. We have no diplomatic dialogue to speak of with China. Secretary Blinken went to Beijing for the purpose of having a meeting. So he had a meeting that accomplished the purpose. The State Department, before he left, said he wasn't going to accomplish anything, and that prediction turned out to be entirely
true.
correct. The only thing he did was to push the Chinese closer to the Russians, because we have a policy that has succeeded in creating a coalition against us of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. Now that is a hell of a diplomatic achievement. Very hard to pull off. None of them agree about anything except the fact that they're in jeopardy from American attack. So this normally statesmen try to divide enemies rather than unite them.
Right.
We're doing the opposite. And I think Mr. Putin understands very well his statement, "Nekulturny," not cultured, is Russian shorthand for not European, because the Russians for centuries have tried to Europeanize themselves with great success. It's a very sophisticated European culture, also non-European in many ways, and we're not part of it. And so that was a throwaway line dividing Europe from the United States, but quite pointed and insulting, I should say.
Right, which of course went right over our heads because we don't even get that. But here's the issue here at stake. You have just very well articulated the problem that our diplomatic core, our foreign policy, is having the opposite effect of what it's supposed to, which is the improvement of our situation, the increasing security of our country. It's having the opposite effect blindly. And part of the reason for that is the blindness at the top. So here on the occasion of signing the bill that this recent $95 billion foreign aid bill that was published last week or so, Biden goes out to say, here's our view of the world. This is what he believes. Contrast that with the one that actually exists.
We don't walk away from our allies. We stand with them. We don't let tyrants win. We oppose them. We don't merely watch global events unfold. We shape them. That's what it means to be the indispensable nation. That's what it means to be the world's superpower and the world's leading democracy. But this vote makes it clear there is a bipartisan consensus for that kind of American leadership. That's exactly what we'll continue to deliver.
We shape events. And you can see here, just of these two scenarios that we've talked about here, one in the Middle East and one in Europe, we're not shaping anything. Everything's being shaped. Well, let me correct that. By and large, like Israel is shaping us. We're in the passenger seat. They're in the driver's seat. And in the Russia-Ukraine situation, we're kind of driving things, just not in a peaceful direction. How do you view his view of the world with the one that actually exists?
It's entirely militaristic and very unrealistic. The world doesn't want more wars. That's what we do. We do military things. As I was describing earlier, we don't do diplomacy anymore. We don't even seem to know what it is. So, yes, we're shaping events. We've managed to shape Europe into a war in which hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, as well as Russians, have died. We are guilty of betraying our allies. I think the Nord Stream pipeline is a great example of that, although we've not had any investigation of that incident, but it does appear that that was done by us. We did walk away from Afghanistan. We're being thrown out of Niger and Chad. We are under pressure to leave Iraq because we're doing things that violate Iraqi sovereignty. Yes, we're shaping the world into a completely lawless, might makes right situation. We're shaping the situation with China in such a way that Chinese see fewer and fewer alternatives to a war over Taiwan. We are shaping the situation with Iran so that they remain our perpetual enemy. This is ridiculous. It would be funny if it were not so consequential. We will pay the price for this kind of delusional statement and perception.
Yeah, I do fear that. And so, I mean, this is almost like, you know, how would you fix the Titanic after it hit the iceberg? Maybe we're in that situation right now. But if you could only list 3 things that you would change about American foreign policy, whether publicly or privately, what would you do?
I'd start by reinstating respect for foreign opinion. That is how our country began. The Declaration of Independence cites a decent opinion of mankind as one of our objectives. We don't show respect to foreigners. We go and we lecture them. We need to listen to them. We need to demonstrate the empathy that is the basis of a constructive relationship. That's across the board. Second, I would pursue peace in Ukraine before Ukraine is further shrunk and devastated by a war that is continually escalating. What we're doing now is escalating the war. We are giving the Ukrainians weapons with which to shoot deep into Russia, despite the fact that we know the Russians will shoot back ever more heavily and destroy more infrastructure and kill more people in Ukraine. So that's the second thing that I would do. And third, I would try to re-examine what commitments we have made and why we've abandoned them with China, for example. Because if we get into a war with China, the only certain result is the total destruction of Taiwan's industry, which would be devastating for the global economy, and its democracy, which would be an unnecessary loss of great consequences. As long as Taiwan exists as a Chinese society and is democratic, which it is, and has a respect for civil and human rights, which it does, there is hope that this may spread to the rest of China in time, because Taiwan sets a good example. If we destroy that, we will see a different China, which will be not one we don't like. Finally, if we get into a war with China, there are crazy people on our side who talk about using nuclear weapons. We've threatened that on at least 3 and possibly 6 occasions with the Chinese before. If we do that, we'll get nuclear weapons fired at us. You know, I'm happy to be in New Hampshire. I think you're in the DC area. You better hide under the desk.
Yeah, I don't think it'll be much worth it by then. Yeah, I don't think it'll be good for anybody at that point. And that's if it goes nuclear. Even if it didn't go nuclear, such a war would, by all accounts, absolutely devastate our entire Indo-Pacific force.
Let me
crush our ability. I think it would change forever the view of American, global power.
I think American global power is already under a denigrated perception. That is to say, when was the last time we won a war? Against whom? When was the last time when we did win a war, like the Gulf War of 1990-91, when we shaped events to produce a better peace?
Better outcome, yeah.
When was the last time? And so I don't think, and if you look at what it means to get into a war with us on your side, think about the fact that the Congress fiddled for 6 months while Ukraine floundered. What kind of example does that set of steadfast support of allies? Are we perceived as wise and worth following? I don't see the evidence for that. So I think even in military terms, which seems to be the only ones we consider, we're taking a hit. And if we get into a war with China, by the way, every war game that's been played shows we lose the bulk of our Air Force and our Navy. Yes. They do too. But they produce 70 times more tonnage of ships per year than we do. They are in the position vis-a-vis us that we were in vis-a-vis Japan in World War II. They are able to reconstitute and supplement their armed forces with huge new building. We're not. We don't have the capability.
And, as an aside, that's the CSIS route path of I think it was 24 scenarios that they ran in their computer simulation. One of the key things that really stood out to me when looking at the after action report where they talked about it was that they only ran it for about 3 weeks, and that's the damage done to the Air Force and the Navy especially. But from what I can understand from other sources is that China is aware of some of the dynamics that we have recently seen play out in Israel and in the Russia-Ukraine war in terms of air defense. So if our naval ships worked, their air defense worked flawlessly and 100% were knocked down, after about 2 weeks, we run out of interceptor missiles. And China makes enough of those that they can saturate it, and every ship could be sunk. I think it could be much worse than they play out.
Well, it could be, but let me make a fundamental point here. China has been involved with Taiwan since 1642, when a rival dynasty was set up following the fall of the Ming and the establishment of the Qing in Beijing. For 40 years, in 11 different attempts, in which cost probably 500,000 lives, the Chinese mainland attempted to reunite Taiwan with it. It finally succeeded in 1682. And
I was not aware
it went on for 40 years through 11 attempts. The assumption that if you win a battle over Taiwan, you've won the war,
it's over.
Is absolute nonsense. This is something Chinese care passionately about.
Wow.
It's part of their country, and we would devote endless resources to recovering California if somehow it were taken by Japan or China or Russia or Mexico. We would never give up. And it's a mistake to imagine the Chinese will give up either. So these scenarios that run short, victorious wars are absolute crap, to put it.
Wow, I never thought of it in those terms either. I'm a little embarrassed to say, but that is such a profound truth. It reiterates our myopic view of everything. We don't look beyond one election cycle or one battle, and that could really come back to haunt us someday. Oops. I think we got locked up a little bit here. But listen, that wraps up our show for today. We thank you very much for coming on today. We've got another show coming up with Jacques Beau later this afternoon on the road of death in Ukraine. Promise you, don't want to miss that one. Jacques has some great insights here, and you are not going to want to miss that. We will see you this afternoon on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.